Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Susan Patrick, the president and CEO of the Aurora Institute. I'm so grateful for everyone joining us today to our webinar to explore NCAA high school eligibility policies. And I'm grateful to have our colleagues at the NCAA joining us and the South Kent School. So if this is your first time attending an Aurora event, our organizational mission is to drive the transformation of education systems and accelerate breakthrough policies and practices to advance high quality and ensure high quality learning for all. So key areas of focus are advancing student-centered learning policies, breakthrough practices for new learning models, such as shifting to K through 12 competency-based education systems, and researching best practices on creating new learning models. This means we work on federal policies, state policies, local policies, and even are learning more about the NCAA policies and how they impact our students and our student athletes. So to cut to the chase, we're getting lots of questions from innovators across the United States in schools, districts, and even at the state level that are advancing competency-based education and student-centered learning. They're asking about how, when they're involved in creating new learning designs, competency-based models, what are the impacts and what are the updates around eligibility for NCAA for student athletes? So next slide. I'm so pleased the NCAA and South Kent School in Connecticut will be here with us to present. Let me introduce our amazing speakers who are here with us today. First, Sarah Overpeck, who's the director of the High School Review at the NCAA Eligibility Center. We've got Kaylin Overway, the assistant director of High School Review at the NCAA. Kevin Benz, who's the Dean of Humanities at the South Kent School. Jesse Brennan, Humanities teacher and Mastery Group Lead at the South Kent School. Raphael, Chillious, the Athletic Director, Director of Basketball and Prep Basketball Coach at the South Kent School. And Lynn Mellis-Worthington, Academic Coordinator, College Counselor, and Humanities Teaching Faculty at the South Kent School. So thank you all for joining today. I want to just say today's goals are really to clarify updates on the NCAA initial eligibility policies, to learn about the context and purpose of NCAA high school review policies, identify some of the key challenges and opportunities for the reviews and the updates, and then synthesize these policy updates into practical steps to help everyone in the field support student-centered learning and our student athletes. So I'd ask, please introduce yourself in the chat. Today, we'd love to know your name, your role, the organization you're joining us from, and where you are. We welcome your questions and comments. I will be reserving the Q&A at the end, but as questions come up, please feel free to add them into the chat box. I'll be monitoring those and facilitating. And if you have comments as the speakers are presenting, please feel free to share those. Also, we're on social media, so share your learning on Twitter with @Aurora_INST. And we'll be recording and archiving the webinar, so it'll be available for you to share with your colleagues later. We'll be sending those out in a few days. So without further ado, again, thanks for joining us today. I'll turn it over to Sarah Overpeck at the NCAA. Sarah?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for being here today. I know your time is valuable, so I'm excited that you've chosen to share this hour with us, and hopefully you'll come away with some helpful information and helpful tips and practices. So I want to start with just kind of why are we here? Why would the NCAA care about high school academics and personalized learning? A common denominator here between the NCAA and high schools is the students, right? More specifically, student athletes. So I'll talk briefly about the requirements for students to be eligible, and then I'll zoom out a bit on why those requirements exist and where they came from. And then we'll kind of zoom back in on some just practices in terms of how we go about working with high schools on those requirements. And then we'll hear from our colleagues at the South Kent School to share some like real-time learning as they make some changes to their own instructional models and think about what that means for their student athletes. So on the next slide, I'll share the Division I qualifier standards for student athletes. So these standards, again, it's just a snapshot for the standards students need to meet to be eligible for athletics aid, practice, and competition at the Division I level. Those students have to meet the progression of core courses before the start of their 7th semester. So 10 NCAA approved core courses before starting their 7th semester. Overall, then, by the time they graduate high school, they need to complete 16 core course units in a specific distribution, earn a core course GPA of at least a 2.3 in those required subject areas, and then submit proof of graduation to the Eligibility Center. Then on the next slide, you'll see that breakdown of courses that I mentioned. So 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 2 years of science, 1 year additional English, math, or science, or extra English, math, or science, 2 years of social studies, and then 4 additional courses. And those could be, they're not electives, they're still core courses, but they could be in the areas of world language, philosophy, comparative religion. Those types of courses are approved in that additional category. On the next slide, you'll see the Division II requirements, quite similar. The only difference here is the Division II standards do not have the 10-7 requirement. So the progression of courses is at any time during a student's high school career, they can complete those 16 core courses. And the GPA requirement is slightly lower. It's 2.2 rather than 2.3 as it is in Division I. And then on the next slide, this is the breakdown of subject area distribution for Division II courses. Just again, similar, but slightly different. So here there's 3 English instead of 4. Most students, if they're meeting state graduation requirements, would have 4 anyway. So a 4th there would just go toward those additional years of English, math, or science. So these obviously all are very specific, very time-based, very course-based, which is kind of why we're here today to talk about how that we have this specific set of requirements for student athletes, how that comes into play with the high schools where those student athletes attended, and then what that means for them in their college career. On the next slide, I mentioned we're going to zoom out a bit and talk about where these requirements came from. So on the next slide, we'll get into that. So these rules, the requirements for student athletes, the way we review courses, or even the fact that student athletes need specific courses for NCAA eligibility, it happens through a governance process. So the NCAA is a member association. All the Division I, II, and III schools are member schools. They develop and approve legislation for their own respective divisions. Division I and II are the only ones. You notice there was no Division III academic requirements. Divisions I and II are where the initial eligibility requirements come into play. And that's mostly rooted in the high stakes of those divisions and the competitive equity that they seek. So those divisions I and II want to make sure that they're competitors, that they're opposing schools and teams aren't allowing students to enter who are not high school students, who are not high school graduates, that they're actually students prepared for college academically. And that they are actually prepared for college. So that's the whole purpose of the Eligibility Center and why it exists, and why we do this work. Those member schools, when they make that legislation, then the legislation that's specific to academics and initial eligibility is then governed by the High School Review Committee. which is a group of both secondary and higher ed representatives who take that legislation and establish policies and procedures for how it will be implemented. How will we go about reviewing the courses that the students took, or the high schools themselves where those courses were taken, to ensure they are eligible to be used in the process. So the high school review committee develops those policies and procedures, and then the high school review staff, which is where Kaylin and I and some of our colleagues come into play, then implement those policies and procedures to determine what courses may actually be used. So we take all of the information from high schools and look at ultimately what courses can be used for those 16 core course requirements for divisions 1 and 2. One thing I meant to mention on the previous slides that I failed to is that a key element that you didn't see on those slides for initial academic eligibility is a standardized test score. So if you haven't heard, last month, the NCAA member schools voted to eliminate the SAT and ACT requirement from initial eligibility standards. So there used to be for Division 1 a sliding scale of GPA and test score that students had to meet, and now it is just that minimum GPA. We also always provide the caveat that there may, of course, still be schools that require that test score for admissions. There might be scholarship reasons that students need a test score, but specifically for NCAA eligibility, that is no longer required. Okay, moving back forward to the next slide. The high school review areas specifically, as we kind of go through that governance process and hone in on the high schools and the courses that students are taking at those high schools. The high school review process entails an account review to look at school policies and operations and oversight of curriculum instruction and assessment. We have upwards of 30,000 high school accounts in our database that have been through this process already. And typically they just then maintain their account. In any given year, we maybe review a couple of hundred new accounts that could be brand new schools, like a new school that just opened, a new virtual school, a new charter school, a new brick and mortar school in a district, whatever the case may be. It might be a brand new school. It also might just be a school that has existed but hasn't been through our process before. So the account review is kind of that high level of just setting everything up, looking at school policies, ensuring that the information we're getting basically is, that we can trust the information and that it's clear and we are understanding the kind of overall picture of the school. Then the program review is the instructional model and expectations. So that's kind of, how is that curriculum being implemented? What does the experience look like for both teachers and students in the instructional model? For courses, we look at the rigor of performance tasks as well as to ensure that it's college preparatory in nature. Again, going back to that ultimate goal that all Division I and Division II student athletes are academically prepared for college level work. There'll be some resources at the end, and when the slides are shared, you'll be able to click through here and look at. You can view all of the policies and procedures and criteria for review. Because we're just going to give you a snapshot today to kind of focus on this set of requirements for students, but then how we've flexed over the years to respond to innovation or changes in the field. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds of the very, very dry reading material of those policies and procedures. But if you're into that, or if you're curious, those are available online, and there'll be a link in these slides. So moving on. Again, what I want to highlight today, before we shift to kind of the case study, if you will, or the perspective of the South Kent School representatives, I want to talk a little bit just about how over time our policies and practices internally have shifted. We have a set of, I mentioned that governance process. We have these legislated requirements. You obviously noticed that all of them were very specific to GPAs and core courses and and very time-based requirements. And that's not necessarily the reality anymore. So we just have kind of responded over time as far as our internal practices of how we can look at school operations and instructional models and work with schools on how that might fit our requirements in some way, even if not directly. How can we explore the ways that it is meeting the requirements? So I'll just kind of go through these one at a time. And again, this is just a snapshot, just some like kind of example elements, not necessarily a full set of requirements, but ones that we wanted to highlight. And my colleague Kaylin will kind of add some color commentary because she's part of the team that does these reviews. So I'll provide a little bit of a picture of the background of where the policy or procedure came from, why it exists, and then Kaylin can talk about just some of the example flexibility that we've developed over the years to help schools and students in this process. So the first one is just the reality of what we do. Our reviews are conducted mainly via written communication and documents. So I mentioned we have 35,000, upwards of 30,000 schools in our database. We don't have the capacity to visit them all, although I wish that we did, because it's one of my favorite things. We do a local school visit here in Indianapolis each year. And I wish that we had the capacity to visit every school that we review, but we just don't. So we rely on written communication and documents. At the sort of beginning of this process, a couple decades ago, when the high school review team and the eligibility center was developed, this was a very, how should I say it? Just a very curt process. School gave us information. There was not a lot of back and forth follow up to better understand it. It was just very cut and dry. You either met the requirements in that initial submission of information or you didn't. So over time, we've just shifted to a little bit more of an open-minded and open-ended approach to the reviews and follow-up questions that we ask, which is not to, hopefully not to just make you feel burdened like we're adding more work when we ask more questions, but really to try and get a complete picture. So Kaylin, I'll see if you have any comments to add there.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So like you said, we ask those questions not to be a burden, but more to really understand what your school and how your school operates. We know that we don't know every single instructional model that's ever created and that's running through schools. And so we know that we have a very distinct and kind of formulaic way of reviewing and formulaic processes to meet. And like Sarah said, the courses and GPA, we have those very distinct things. And so we do our best to ask those questions so that we can understand on the front end, before giving a decision, how your school works and how we can fit that into our model to benefit the student athletes the best way that we can.
Yeah, very well said. Thanks, Kaylin. Yeah, we have, we're trying to standardize and streamline a process, but then also on a case-by-case basis, or just one-off once we review the documentation, just try and then sort of re-expand to look at the information that's in front of us and the reality of the school that's submitting the information. The next item here is subject area core course requirements. So those initial slides that I shared are obviously, again, very tied to subject areas, very tied to, courses, not competencies, although they're, of course, probably, hopefully embedded in those courses, but just very, very still tied to a traditional way of schooling. And just over time, we've, recognized in our processes that there's interdisciplinary courses or interdisciplinary competencies and curricula and interdisciplinary assessments. So Kaylin, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so we understand that, like Sarah said, there are those interdisciplinary and project-based learning classes. So during our review process, we do ask for sample assessments just so that we can get a better understanding of your courses and the college preparatory nature. And like Sarah said earlier, that content and the performance task, the rigor of the performance task. So we asked for those assessments and we recognize that there may be one project that covers a variety of competencies and a variety of, for our sake, core courses, and it fits in multiple buckets. They may be asked to write a letter, but also maybe they're writing a letter to the zoning board to talk about the geometry of a certain building and how that should be built. And so we understand that that could be both an English assessment and a geometry assessment. So whereas before we were very formulaic, if we need 3 distinct geometry assessments and 3 distinct English, now we understand that those things may flow together a little bit more. And so we actually do look at your assessments before making that decision, and we recognize what portions of courses you're pulling into those assessments.
Thanks, Caitlin. And we'll talk a little bit more about just the sort of course versus competency and curriculum concept in a little bit. But next up, the regular and ongoing student-teacher interaction for teaching, evaluating, and providing assistance. This is very specific to our non-traditional course legislation. So the way that's defined in the NCAA legislation is online, blended, hybrid, computer-based, or otherwise, essentially not face-to-face legislation. So this is one of those requirements that the student-teacher interaction has to be for all 3 of those purposes, and it has to be regular and ongoing. Again, this was developed at a time, this piece of legislation and the non-traditional legislation as a whole, it was implemented in 2010, developed over the course of 2008, 2009, and then implemented in 2010, which was a very different time for online learning and education as a whole. So this type of requirement was in direct response to what member schools and what the Eligibility Center staff was seeing at the time in like computer printouts for student athletes, where they were completing a course in, 4 hours. Obviously, we've come a long way in online learning, but this was in direct response to that of just what is needed in a quality online course, and student-teacher interaction. I don't think any of us would argue that that's not important. But the way it was reviewed at the time was very strict, and just very, do you have regular and ongoing interaction? What does that look like? Do you have synchronous sessions? And while the legislation doesn't require, synchronous or real-time or face-to-face interaction, a lot of times that's how it was interpreted from both the user side and from the staff side. So we've really come a long way in our review practices of just how we explore the program and ask questions to help us understand what that student-teacher interaction and engagement looks like. Caitlin, I'm sure you have lots to add here because this is Caitlin's specific review area.
Yeah. So again, this kind of goes back to that first point where we'll ask more questions just to get a better understanding of how your model and how your instructional model works, and not just what's required, but also what's done in practice, and see how those work together. So like Sarah said, before it was pretty formulaic, and if you met it, you met it, and if you didn't, you didn't. And it was just kind of on that first look at the questionnaires. And it was really looking for that almost basically lecture style, just in an online format, where all of the direct instruction is happening on the front end. But we understand that there are a variety of ways that instruction is happening in different instructional models. So for some of our more non-traditional, what we say non-traditional courses and programs, we will look to see how that teacher is engaging, whether that's on the front end and providing instruction that way, or if it's on the back end and after an assessment of some kind, providing that feedback that's really instructional in nature, where the student is being asked to really extend their thinking and extend their knowledge and do something more with the content that they've already done. So not just, I was an English teacher formerly, so not just great job, but your thesis is really strong and you've got some really good quotes, but the citations aren't right, or we really haven't fully thought out how we're going to use those quotes to back up what you're saying, and you really need to explain them, not just put the quote in everywhere. So we're looking at different ways that that feedback is coming from, and that interaction for that teaching purpose and that evaluating and the providing assistance is coming.
Thanks, Caitlin. Sort of along those same lines, the next item on here is very specific to our non-traditional course legislation, the defined time period for completion of a course. So again, from that same set of legislation that was developed in 0809, implemented in 2010, and again, was in direct response to those very, very short timeframes for courses. Now, we're working right now with our high school review committee. So that governance structure that I showed you earlier is really a two-way path. So the member schools decide the legislation, the high school review committee determines how we're going to implement it through policies and procedures, and then the staff does that day to day. But there's also kind of a feedback loop there where the high school review staff then can inform the committee, hey, here's what we're seeing. Like, here's the realities. And they are also in the field. So they we have those discussions regularly. And what we're working on right now is potentially some updated legislation, understanding that if what we're looking at is a quality course that prepares a student for college, just telling someone that they can't do it in 4 days or they can't do it very rapidly is not necessarily working toward that goal. A quality course inherently probably won't be able to be completed in 4 hours or 4 days or whatever the case may be. And time isn't really the determining factor there. It's really about the course content and the rigor of performance tasks and assessments. But for now, we do still have this requirement. So what we try to do is just reframe it based on curriculum and instruction. A lot of schools don't have a published minimum time frame. It's not something that a lot of schools even consider. And so a lot of times they'll go through our process and say, no, we don't have one, because they wouldn't think that they need to publish, you can't complete this course sooner than 4 weeks. It's just part of their normal practice that a student is in a course for a certain amount of time. So we really just try to work with schools to figure out, okay, are you meeting this requirement through how you're conducting your instruction? So Caitlin, you have anything to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the time frame component, we really look at how it's being enforced, and basically looking at, in common practice, in actuality, how fast could a student finish that course? And it also has to holistically work with that regular and ongoing student-teacher interaction. So in some cases, schools have recorded video lessons that students can't fast forward through. There's no way to skip past them. They have to watch all of those lessons. So that in and of itself provides a minimum time frame, because they simply cannot finish sooner than watching those lessons. And while there's way more that goes into that course because of the assessments and because of maybe the discussions and things that are happening with the course, that in and of itself meets the defined time period for completion. But then we have to check to make sure that that's working with the regular and ongoing student-teacher interaction. So for instance, if your defined time period for completion is 30 hours, because that's the number of hours that you have to watch videos from the lessons, but your student-teacher interaction is happening on a weekly basis. Well, if I only have to interact with my student once a week and they can complete the course in 30 hours, essentially they could only be interacting with their teacher once a week. So that isn't regular and ongoing throughout the duration of the course. So we're looking at how those defined time period for completion fits with that student-teacher interaction. And it could be in a variety of ways, especially if you take into consideration with feedback, because that's happening with so many assessments and that's happening throughout the course. That's how we're kind of looking at the defined time period for completion and asking you what it is that you are doing. And like Sarah said, maybe it's not published, but you all know your courses and you all know your programs very well, that it's just not possible because of the content and because of the rigor of the course to finish a course any sooner than X amount of time. Thanks,
Caitlin. The next item and kind of the main focus and why we're here is the course grade and credit requirements. And we had a question come in that might be addressed in this component here before we move on to hear from South Kent School. But this, again, the student athlete requirements are still framed in terms of courses, grades, and credits. And again, a lot of that has to do with just the processing needs we process 200,000 student certifications between approximate high school graduation time in May, June, and the time that they're trying to get on campus in August. So a lot of this is just purely processing efficiency, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do what's right. So that's where this kind of my team's efforts in this area come in. So if there's a school that doesn't meet that model, you know, a mastery-based or competency-based school that doesn't have course titles on their transcript, or does not award letter or numeric grades, or doesn't have Carnegie units on their transcript, what we try to do is develop a crosswalk or some other conversion to say, here's what this could equal. Essentially, this set of competencies, we would approximately call it English 1. We know it's going to be vastly imperfect to what's actually happening in your school, but again, what our mutual goal here is student readiness for college and getting them through this eligibility process as smoothly as possible. So we try to again look at what sets of competencies could align to certain course titles, what levels of proficiency could at your school or program align to a certain letter grade, again, because we have that minimum GPA requirement for student athletes, and at what point of completion or proficiency might that be considered awarded a credit. Again, it's very imperfect. I won't pretend that it's like an ideal state, because it's essentially taking this innovation and you know, different model of learning, different model of indicating and identifying mastery and putting it back in the box it came away from. So, but for now, we hope that we can get there with schools, and we learn more every year about how to do this work better and more efficiently. And it really takes this type of scenario, you know, just coming to you all, sharing this information, and then hearing from you in turn. And that's really how we even came to have South Kent School join us on this webinar, because they did reach out to us about this process and making sure that they were getting ahead of it and thinking about their student athletes and how they hopefully wouldn't be hung up in the NCAA process. So Kaylin, before I turn it over, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to that very first point again, where we're not asking questions to be a burden. We're asking questions and figuring out how we can set your student athletes up in the best way possible. So in the past, a pass-fail grade was given just the lowest passing grade and the quality point, which in many schools would be a D. And so that 2.0 on the quality point scale wouldn't reach that 2.3 or 2.2 GPA requirement for Divisions 1 and Division 2. But by asking you all for that conversion, and we understand that that's not what you do, but by giving us that conversion, if for you that P for pass is actually equivalent to what in a normal school, or in a, not normal, I'm sorry, but in a more traditional school would be a B+ or an A, then we have that conversion on file. So then your student athletes are getting the benefit of that pass grade for what it truly is, because of the rigor of your course. They're truly getting that 4.0 quality point as opposed to that 2.0. So it's really asking just to better understand your school and your transcript and your model, and how we can set your student athletes up for the best possible combination of grades and quality points from all the competencies.
Thanks, Kaylin. So next up, we're going to hear from some folks who are doing this work and moving toward a mastery-based model, and some of the perspectives and considerations they've had in this process. So I'll hand it over to Jesse.
Thank you, Sarah and Kaylin. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really excited to be here with you to share our journey. Thank you to the Aurora Institute for organizing this. This is exciting. I see some of you have been commenting that it really is truly exciting, and the good work keeps going. So we're going to share with you our mastery journey, but we want to emphasize that your journey, no matter where it is, if it's just a spark of an idea right now, if it's started, if you're knee deep in it, your journey is unique, and that's okay. It's going to be difficult, but at the end of the day, you should take pride in the fact that you have clearly made a commitment to put student-centered learning as the priority at your school. We also want to invite you. This is, as I said, difficult work, and it can be challenging, and sometimes it's good to connect and hear what others are doing. So we invite you to reach out to any of us at any point. You can contact us, ask questions, comments. We would love to build a network and really push mastery, competency-based learning as far as we can get it to go. But at this time, I'd like to pass it over to Kevin, the Humanities Department Chair at South Kent School, who's going to kind of introduce you to how we got started on our mastery journey.
Thank you, Jesse. Before I begin, we can move to the next slide as well. Just how inspiring it is to see so many educators, administrators, and professionals on the call who are all focused on the same topic. Our journey, South Kent School's journey towards mastery, began in 2017. We invited an education consultant to campus to speak about grading. And one of the activities in that professional development opportunity included each faculty member grading a single piece of student writing. And the results were a disparity in grades, everything from an A to an F for the same student writing sample from a diversity of faculty. And the problem that came out of that was not just the lack of consistency in grading, but also a lack of clarity in what a grade represents. What is the difference between an A and a B, for example? And both of these problems, the inconsistency in grading and the lack of clarity on what the grade represents, ultimately is to the detriment of student learning, which is really why we are all here. And so we as a faculty came together and recognized that there's a need for solutions. And we began a search for different models in grading. That search, as it continued, we began to realize that it wasn't just grades where there were some problems within our curriculum, but also problems in the way that we teach our students and problems in the way that we assess our students' learning, and those needed solutions as well. We ultimately, at the end of that search, landed on a mastery model for us at South Kent School, because that mastery model encompasses solutions to all three of those areas that we wanted solutions for: grading, assessing, and then instruction or teaching. My advice to any educators or administrators or schools on the call who are interested in maybe beginning their journey is to make sure that you have a strong identity. And what I mean by that is you understand what you, your faculty, your students, and all of your student stakeholders, what you need and what you want out of an education model. That's really important, because it's going to help you in identifying the model that fits best for you and not the other way around. I'm going to pass it back to Jesse, who's going to introduce some other considerations that you might want to consider when you begin your own journey.
So if your school is considering exploring a switch to mastery-based learning, ultimately your decision needs to be rooted in your students' learning and holistic development. Once you explore the evidence behind this type of learning, there are other considerations that need to be addressed early on in the decision process. If you can go to the next slide, please. Some of these considerations include educating your stakeholders, from your students, your parents, your teachers, your administrators, right? Other community members. Being ready to invest in professional development to support adjustments to instructional practices. Investment doesn't necessarily just mean money, but also the time, right, for your teachers to collaborate, to support each other as they implement this change. And ensuring that this decision, and why we're all here, that this decision does not have adverse impact on NCAA eligibility or college admissions process. Raphael Chillious will speak more specifically about the NCAA eligibility and requirements in a little bit. Continuing on to the next slide, please. For those of you who may remember the great TV show, The Magic School Bus, you have to embrace Miss Frizzle's advice. You need to take chances, you need to make mistakes, and you need to get messy. Change is inevitable and change is messy. You as a school, as a district, right? Everyone has to be committed to the goal of placing student-centered learning first, right? And committed to the fact that things are going to change and you need to be flexible. Everything is interconnected. And as you begin this journey, you will come to find out that you need to alter not only possibly your schedule. So yeah, thank you. You may alter your schedule. You may have to rewrite your learning targets, your standards. You may have to redefine your competencies. You're going to have to change up, adapt, right? Instructional practices. You have to think about what is being reported home, what sort of communication is going home, keeping student growth and learning central to your purpose. But at the end of the day, again, it's always about the student growth, health, and learning. And now I'll share some resources that we have consulted as we've gone through this process. We are a member of the Mastery Transcript Consortium, and we've done some professional development in groups as a faculty, reading some of the various works here, as well as also in smaller groups. We've also consulted and worked with Emily Rinkema and Stan Williams over the summer to write standards and learning targets and scale them and plan out differentiation in the classroom. But all of these works here have been really helpful for us as we've moved through our process. So now I will pass it on to my colleague Lynn, who will share ways in which we've been working with the NCAA.
Thanks, Jesse. So when we first started talking about the mastery learning and discussing the implications of it, we knew that the NCAA was going to be or could be a big problem for us because we have so many student athletes. Because in terms of letting go of grades, we knew that a significant part of our population of 150 students, it's the NCAA is a huge issue for them. So I did reach out to Sarah earlier this school year, and I was so relieved after that conversation because we realized it was very possible with the right supports in place. And she assured us that the NCAA was there to help guide us through the process, which was wonderful. As I mentioned, we are a school of 150 students, all boys, grades 9 through postgraduate. And in the past 5 years, we've sent an average of 34 athletes each year to college, with 60% of them going to D1 colleges. So it is a significant thing for us to work through this. So after that discussion with Sarah, we realized that we were going to need to create a one-pager policy that would delineate the conversion of the mastery based grades, the learning targets, to letter grades. And we also know that we have to think about the considerations, the implications of grade changes, because anybody who's involved in competency-based or mastery learning understands that the whole goal is to get students to revise and resubmit. And that might mean their level on a learning target or a standard is going to change. I mean, hopefully it does. So we need to be thinking about that, talking about that, and figuring out how we're going to write it all down for the NCAA to understand what has happened. And if there is a change in the letter grade, or a change in the grade of the proficiency, that we should expect to hear questions from the NCAA and have additional information such as the syllabus, assessments, that kind of thing ready at the ready. So I am going to pass this off to Raphael Chillious for his contributions.
So one thing I don't, as a coach, I don't ever want to assume is that even though we're discussing mastery, that everyone has an exact example of what mastery looks like. So in essence, and Kevin and Jesse and Lynn can jump in where me not being in the classroom, that I might diverge a little bit. But essentially what mastery is that with our learning targets and standards, we assume that with differentiated learning, every student is not, they don't start in the same spot. And if we're looking at and using a ninth grader, we call them a third former here, for example, there may be a class in humanities that they're taking as a freshman, and they're different spots, like they have different spots in the class where would be normally grading, where there might be an example called emerging or master the class. And maybe as a freshman, they only made it to emerging in that one particular subject area, but they still have moved on to what would be the 10th grade, still haven't reached the ultimate learning target as a freshman, but they've met the ability to move forward to the next grade. And so with mastery, what it allows is during that 10th grade, the student still has the ability to master what they didn't master as a ninth grader. So that's the part where Lynn was giving an example that maybe you have to go back and show that they moved from emerging to actually master that material. In a lot of ways, we do our assessments at the end of the term is that students have capstone projects where they've been working all quarter long on their own or within a group, along with the teacher's guidance, to actually show us that they've actually mastered the material for that class. So that's as most simplified as I can explain it. But the process of watching students learn this way, especially boys, as we know, boys learn a little bit differently, to watch them go through the process of submission, resubmission, adjusting this, speaking with the teacher, working with the group. It's really amazing to watch students learn over time. Now, as it relates to student athletes, there's some bullets here. For me, it's not the first bullet, it's the second bullet, is that Sarah mentioned it, that 10-7 rule is probably the hardest one, and Sarah could let me know. So for when sometimes student athletes have to go through an initial eligibility waiver process because maybe they're missing this or they're missing that, or NCAA is not clear about a subject or a class that was taught to them. That 10-7 rule is one that the NCAA really, really does not wiggle on. You want to make sure that your student athletes have met that 10-7 rule going into after their 10th semester of high school, because initial eligibility tend to be one of the hardest waivers to overcome if a student is short on something. And so I myself recruited a student athlete who was actually a good student and met his 16 core requirement overall. He had transferred from his school in 10th grade to another school for 11th and 12th grade and still did well. While he was at his new school, his previous school removed that class from his original 48H form from the school he went to. And so when he went through the review process to NCAA, that class that he needed for his 16 core was no longer accepted by the NCAA because it didn't reside on his previous school's 48H form. And so one of the notes I would say is to make sure in your high schools that when you have transfer students, that when they come in, their original transcript, you might want to make sure you're still in constant communication with the previous school, that all the courses that he took at that school or that she took at that school on their 48H form still exists. And if they're thinking about archiving it or removing it from the 48H form, that I would work in concert with that school and the NCAA to say, okay, such and such took this course when he was there, now he's here, and they're about to remove it from the H form. What do we need to do to ensure that he does not lose that, or she doesn't lose that core course in their initial eligibility breakdown? They may have to take another course at their school, at your current school, to make up for that class, if that makes sense. Also, I think it's really big for student athletes is the idea of there's differentiated learning. And we have kids who come to our schools who may have a 504-1 plan where they have a learning difference. And as you may or may not know, that we have postgraduates at our school. So we go 9th through a postgraduate year. And in our sports programs, we often have lots of postgrads who come to our school. A traditional postgrad, meaning a student who does not have documented a learning difference, they are going to be able to receive one extra core course towards their original 16 core courses to be a qualifier. So if they come up short qualifying in their traditional high school year, they can go to a postgraduate year and get that one course if they fall one course short. Or they can use that course to replace a lower grade in the course they took earlier on. But when it comes to students and student athletes who have a documented learning difference, they're able to receive up to 3 additional core courses during that additional year of high school. So it's important to know that. We just went through having a student athlete apply here. And I initially, when I found out what his GPA was, I was like, he's a little short. We cannot take him because we're going to do him a disservice if we don't tell his family that if he comes here and doesn't do really well, there's a great chance that he's not going to be a qualifier. Are they okay with that? That he may still have to go to a junior college after attending here for a year. But then once we got all of his paperwork in, we saw that he had a learning difference and that he's going to be able to take up to 3 core classes for that postgraduate year. And my concerns were relieved if he does what he's supposed to do in our classroom. So I say all this to say it's really important in your school, especially if someone's coming in they didn't come to your school as a freshman, they may have come to your school as a 10th or 11th grader, to really review their transcript, not just from the registrar's office, but from the NCAA eligibility. That people in your school have to be thinking about that. Because not every student who comes to your school as a freshman, they may walk in your school as a freshman and have not experienced and really known that they're going to end up at the end of their high school careers being a student athlete who's recruited to a Division II or Division I school. They may be playing lacrosse because they just like lacrosse, but they might develop over time and become a Division II or Division I recruited student athlete. So as a freshman, you have to be certain that those 16 core courses and the class that are required for them to meet NCAA eligibility, that all students in your school, whether they play sports or not, you take a look at it from an NCAA initial eligibility perspective as well. I have lots of stories. I was a college coach for almost 13 years at the Division I level, at the highest levels. And so I probably haven't seen more than Sarah, but I've seen a lot of cases where initially students may fall into a bucket where they may fall into review unbeknownst to them or their school based upon the wording of a course that they took that's on their 48H form, or that a course has not been quite yet approved by the NCAA. So you have to understand that the first point I have is always make sure any courses that you add to your 48H form, that your student athletes know where you are and their parents know where you are in the process with the NCAA. Has it already been approved? Is there a class that was previously approved, but for some reason was archived, that the school needs to get reapproved or out of the archive for the NCAA, or it's just not approved yet? And you have to understand and have patience in the initial eligibility process that maybe your student's initial eligibility maybe delayed a little bit as that course is being approved by the NCAA. If there are any questions in that regard into initial eligibility issues, or not issues, but best practices for your student athletes, feel free to ask. And I'm handing it off back to Aurora.
Thank you. Let's jump into some questions right now. So the first one that I have is from Matt, and I was really curious about capstones too. How do you handle student design work? So if a student is doing a year-long capstone project where the students designed it, how does that come into, how does the NCAA consider that when mapping to the competencies? So Sarah or Kaylin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to give a classic answer here of it depends, but there's a couple ways that we might review this. So if the level of personalization is such that there's still kind of a baseline content map or curriculum map that we can look at, where the student might be selecting, I don't know, certain texts to read from a group of 5, but what they're being asked to do and the performance tasks are similar or the same even, then that could potentially just be an approved course, even though the student experience might vary. If it's going to be highly individualized, where it's literally, student designed and it will be completely different from student to student, then that could still potentially be approved. It would just be at the student level. So we would look at how at the actual performance tasks and that the student completed him or herself, and then review it and approve it at the student level. So it just maybe wouldn't be a course that would live on a school's list, but it could be what we call pending individual review, where we would then review the actual student completion of it.
Thank you. And I saw Kate asked, how long does it take to find out if your courses get approved? And the answer in the chat was very fast. It can be one to 2 days. So the other question that came up was really directed at Lynn. If a student achieves a beginning level of proficiency learning, say in typical grade 9, but then goes deeper, develops, achieves a higher level in the same learning target later, maybe even the next year. So do you go back and update the proficiency level from that grade 9? We heard about resubmission. Like, how do you deal with that?
We are like right at the very beginning stages of this. So we're trying to use Blackbaud as our platform, but we are to be honest, we hope to move to the mastery learning record, which we think is going to be a better tool for us to be able to do this kind of thing. So we haven't had a whole lot of experience of actually changing the proficiency, but it happens automatically in our Blackbaud system because our youngest students, the 9th graders and the 10th graders are doing it right now. So when they like go from STEM to humanities class, there's some crossover. So they might have achieved it in the STEM class, whereas they were emerging in the humanities class. That's about the best answer I can give. Jesse may have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. We're in the beginning stage of this. Obviously, the whole idea is that the benefit of this style of learning is that you get an accurate idea of what the student can do at that time. And so I think I noticed the term crosswalk grades, which I'm assuming is this idea of a conversion. That's funny. I haven't seen that before, but yeah, I think for the time being, that's a challenge that we have to decide how to handle and try to figure out. But it is an interesting and kind of one of those areas where the kind of legacy grades and then this competency or mastery-based grading, they don't jive too well. So kind of a pedagogical or institutional decision you also have to kind of consider on a larger scale.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I am just looking at the clock and realizing that we're out of time. And let me just say, please, thank you to all of our presenters from the NCAA, from South Kent. We are so grateful.